So display analyst Ross Young and supply chain expert Min-Chi Kuo believe that we could see an OLED iPad Air and a mini LED version of the MacBook Air launch in 2022. Now, the MacBook Air does make a lot of sense to me. I think that is very plausible, but the iPad Air just doesn't seem very likely to me, and so let's delve into why I disagree. And so without further ado, make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. And with that being said, let's just tuck in. So before I start venting about the iPad Air, let's delve into the MacBook Pro. So we already know from Mark Gurman that in 2022, we should see a refreshed MacBook Air with, of course, a newer design that's thinner and lighter, possibly thinner bezels, more ports, but most importantly, mini LED. And so I'm glad to see that Ross Young and Min-Chi Kuo both agree with Mark Gurman and that we should see mini LED on the MacBook Air next year. Now this does make a lot of sense because mini LED is obviously coming to the MacBook Pros later this year, and historically we have seen features from the Pro come down to the Air a little later because of course it's the entry-level model. Apple wants to keep the price relatively affordable, and so giving it the cutting edge features is just not possible, and so Apple lets the tech get cheaper and then eventually they bring it over to the Air. Case in point, the big redesign we saw back in 2016 with the MacBook Pros only came to the Air in 2018, so it took Apple 2 years to bring the modern design with a Retina display. And so I'm sure that mini LED won't be coming to the Air as soon as possible, and it makes sense we see it in 2022. Now that's all great, but then we have this OLED iPad Air, and that's where my issues arise with this report. So weirdly enough, this is not the first time we're hearing about an OLED iPad Air, because you might remember I covered in a video a report from Digitimes pretty much covering the same thing. They think the first OLED iPad will be the iPad Air and it could launch as soon as early 2022. And so it's pretty interesting that credible sources like Min-Chi Kuo and Ross Young also think the same, because honestly, this just makes no sense to me. Why would Apple give a superior display technology to their mid-range iPad? Because yes, in case you don't know, mini LED is not better than OLED. It's still weaker in terms of blacks, contrast ratio, brightness. There are a lot of disadvantages with mini LED compared to OLED. In fact, let me try and use biscuits to help you guys understand the differences. And yes, it sounds mad, but bear with me. So I would say the LCD is like digestives. It's just a regular biscuit, nothing too special about it as such, but it does the job. But then we get to mini LED. This is a chocolate digestive, and so it builds upon the foundations of LCD / digestives, but it has that chocolatey goodness on the top. That is of course extra LEDs and more dimming points, which means you get higher brightness and better contrast ratios. And at last, we have OLED, and this is leaps and bounds better than any other biscuit out there. And so OLED is like a custard cream, and so it's just the GOAT. There is no other display tech that can match the abilities of OLED right now. And so yes, moving on from my crazy comparison, what I'm trying to say is that mini LED is a slightly better version of LCD, but it definitely isn't better than OLED. And so if Apple's thinking of differentiating the iPad's lineup, then it makes sense to have OLED on the Pro and of course the Air getting mini LED. Because yes, to add to the confusion, apparently mini LED and OLED will exist together, And so that's just going to confuse the lineup in my opinion, because imagine trying to choose between LCD on the regular iPad, OLED on the iPad Air, and then mini LED on the iPad Pro. It makes no sense. And imagine the average consumer trying to wrap their head around a Super Retina XDR display, a Liquid Retina display, and what I'm assuming mini LED will be, which is Liquid Retina XDR. And so imagine trying to understand the differences as an average consumer, because that's just a bunch of words that make no sense. And so, yeah, I think this isn't a great idea. And to add to that, like I mentioned in my original video about this OLED iPad Air, imagine the confusion within the supply chain when Apple's trying to make OLED, LCD, and mini LED iPads. That just sounds like a train wreck waiting to happen, and especially during the pandemic with supply constraints, this again makes it seem like this is a bad idea. Now, thankfully, unlike the original DigiTimes report, we do have some context on why Apple's doing this from Min-Chi Kuo, and he basically says that apparently the OLED in the iPad Air will be a slightly more rigid version of the display technology, and so this basically means it should be worse than the Super Retina XDR displays we have on the iPhone 12. Now, Kuo does go on to say that apparently this rigid version of OLED should be less challenging to make, and so that basically means Apple can make these displays at a much cheaper cost, and so that basically means we should not see a price hike with the iPad Air. And so basically Min-Chi Kuo is saying that this OLED should be a slightly worse version of the OLEDs we're used to on the iPhones, and that should hopefully mean the mini LED displays on the iPad Pro will still be better. But honestly, I still kinda doubt that, because obviously I'm assuming Apple's gonna keep the same resolution as we have today on the iPad Air, which is 2048 by 1536, and that is a pretty crispy number, and imagine how good a display of that resolution would be with OLED. And so I highly doubt mini LED on the iPad Pros will be any better than the OLED we see on the iPad Air, because again, I have to say, mini LED is a glorified version of LCD, OLED has the better blacks, better contrast ratios, better viewing angles. I can just keep going on and on. Mini LED is still going to be worse than OLED. And so yes, I'm still very much confused about this, and hopefully we do get more context as to what exactly Apple is doing with the next generation iPad Air. But tell me in the comments below, what do you prefer? Do you like OLED, or are you scared of the burn-in, which rarely happens to be honest, but it does happen? And do you prefer LCD instead? Anyways, thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. Check out the video in the iCard above about the iPad Pro launching in April and the Thunderbolt connector possibly coming with it. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps.